Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dr. Robert Golden, Dean of the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. I also serve as the chair of the board of UW Health, the university's academic health system. I'm joined this evening by Dr. Alan Kaplan, who is the Chief Executive Officer of UW Health. Welcome to our 2021 launch of the Wisconsin Medicine Livestream. We will be bringing you 10 new programs, one every other Wednesday evening, now through June. Alan and I will alternate the honor of serving as your host on each of the subsequent programs. For tonight's presentation, we're turning our focus to UW Health's nationally renowned organ transplantation program. It's a very timely topic. Earlier in the month, we announced a truly transformative gift to the UW Health Transplant Center from Pleasant Rowland, founder of the Pleasant Company, now known as American Girl, and well-known Madison philanthropist. A former patient, Ms. Rowland has donated $10 million toward the construction of a new state-of-the-art transplant clinic at University Hospital, which will be named the Pleasant T. Rowland Transplant Clinic. Our transplant program has impacted the lives of thousands of people, including countless patients from beyond Wisconsin's borders. We have imagined, created, and developed new medications, technology, patient care systems, and surgical techniques that have transformed the way people from around the world experience organ donation and transplantation. We are proud of our history and are completely committed to enhancing the future of transplantation. To share more about the impact of our transplant center's success, I'd like to invite Dr. Alan Kaplan to join me. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Bob. Well, the relationship between organ donors and transplant recipients has always been defined by incredible acts of generosity on one side and deep gratitude on the other. For more than 55 years, our team has reimagined, improved, and built the future of transplantation. Consistently ranked among the nation's busiest centers, our team has prolonged the lives of more than 18,000 organ recipients over the years. In fact, 2020 was a record year. Even with the complexities of the pandemic, we completed 548 transplants, including a record 315 kidney transplants. Our team was proud to serve 173 deceased donors and 87 living donors. We extend our deepest gratitude to the people who made these gifts of life possible. Our internationally renowned transplant center has taken another step forward thanks to the generosity of Pleasant Rowland. Beginning next month, UW Health will launch the first phase of construction for the new transplant clinic, which will improve patient access, significantly expand clinical space, advance our technology, and enhance patient experience. This evening, you will hear from a few of our expert physicians who will share their work in paired kidney donations, the impact of COVID-19 in our UW Health Heart Transplant Program, a designated center of excellence and the only program in the state performing minimally invasive mechanical assist device implantation. Research at UW has a rich legacy of impacting the world. One of many remarkable breakthroughs is the University of Wisconsin Cold Storage Solution, otherwise referred to as the UW solution. It was developed in the 1980s by surgeon Volker Belzer and scientist James Southard. 4 decades later, it remains the gold standard for organ preservation, allowing the safe transportation of transplant organs over long distances from donor to recipient. We are incredibly proud of our legacy of patient care and scientific breakthroughs at UW Health and UW School of Medicine and Public Health, and grateful for the opportunity to continue to have a positive impact on the lives of our patients and their families. And for us, being good or even great is never good enough, as our transplant team will exemplify tonight.
Thank you, Alan. And now, to get us started with tonight's talks, I'd like to introduce Dr. Didier Mandelbrot. Dr. Mandelbrot is the Virginia Lee Cook Professor in Transplant Nephrology. He serves as the chief of the Transplant Nephrology section and also as medical director of the UW Health Kidney and Pancreas Transplantation Program. He maintains a very active clinical research program focusing on factors contributing to transplant rejection. Welcome, Dr. Mandelbrot.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me speak this evening. I'm going to start with a few general comments about the UW Health Transplant Center, and then I'll move into my more specific talk about paired kidney donation. So it's important to remember that the Transplant Center actually has three different components. The Transplant Program itself, which is what I'm most closely affiliated with, but also includes UW organ and tissue donation, which is loosely referred to as the organ bank, and I should mention has among the best metrics in terms of organs recovered in the whole country, and has had those best metrics for many years. And then there's also the HLA laboratory, which provides really outstanding service and really continues to push the technology forward to improve tissue typing for the transplant program. Next slide. So as was mentioned, the program's been around for 55 years. This is really one of the oldest programs in the country, clearly one of the largest programs in the country, and I'm confident it's also one of the best programs in the country. It really has a very broad reach. We have patients coming from we have many patients in the surrounding states coming to list at UW, Illinois, Michigan, Iowa, Minnesota, but also patients coming from New York and Massachusetts and California to come list with us to get transplanted here. We've transplanted over 18,000 organs over the years. There are actually 7 different transplant programs for adults. They include kidney, pancreas, islet, liver, heart, lung, and combined organs. The programs also include 4 pediatric programs, 3 VA programs, and 2 living donor programs, the living donor kidney and liver programs, which are areas of particular interest of mine and that I'll be talking about one aspect of this evening. Next slide. So I'll be talking about paired kidney donation. Next slide. And I'll start out by saying that I don't have any financial relationships to disclose, but I will be speaking quite a bit about the National Kidney Registry, or NKR. The NKR actually performs the most paired kidney donation transplants in the country. And we have a long history at UW of collaborating with them. A number of us have served on their board of directors and their research committee, and I like to think we've helped move their pioneering programs forward. And in turn, we've benefited a great deal from our collaborations with them. And in fact, our kidney program has performed more paired donor transplants through the NKR than any other program in the country. Next. So by way of background to living donation in general, kidney transplantation from a living donor is the best treatment for end-stage kidney disease. So we know that in general, transplantation is a better treatment for end-stage kidney disease than dialysis. And if you're going to get a kidney transplant, we know that a living donor kidney will give you better outcomes and will be able to be transplanted sooner compared to a deceased donor kidney. Next slide. So unfortunately, many of the live donors that come forward and are interested in donating to an intended recipient turn out to be incompatible, either because of HLA incompatibilities or ABO blood type incompatibilities. So this is what led to the development of these paired kidney exchanges. So this shows just sort of the simplest form of a paired exchange, where you have a blood donor who's blood type A and wants to donate to their recipient who's blood type B, and therefore they're incompatible. And then there's another donor who's blood group B and wants to donate to a recipient that's blood type A. And we can do simply a simultaneous two-way swap and have both recipients benefit and get a live donor transplant. This is just the simplest form, but these swaps or paired exchanges can be much more complex. They can be 3-way, they can be 4-way. And in particular, they can actually be extended chains. So next. So this shows an example from a publication in the New England Journal many years ago of a non-simultaneous extended altruistic donor chain. Altruistic donor is another way of saying a non-directed donor. And the idea is if you look at the left, there's a non-directed donor that donates into the pool and to one specific recipient. And then that recipient's donor then at a later time donates to another recipient, et cetera. And all these donor recipient pairs go into this paired exchange system being incompatible. But then by having the option of these extended chains, all these recipients can be helped and transplanted. Next. So this is these chains have become very popular and very successful. This is an example from a story in the New York Times in 2012. The donor at the top left was a non-directed donor who ended up helping 30 patients who had a live donor but not a compatible live donor end up getting transplanted in a single chain. And the Transplant Center at UW has been very involved in these chains. And in fact, a few years ago, we actually transplanted the last recipient of what was at the time the longest chain ever, which is actually longer than this one here. Next. So paired exchange has been very successful and has grown a great deal in the last 15 years. You can see from 27 transplants in the red lines to over 1,000 in recent years. And in the blue line, it shows the number of paired exchange transplants facilitated by the National Kidney Registry. And you can see that the NKR has really facilitated the majority of these paired exchange transplants throughout the United States. Next. And one more recent development, sort of one great step forward, is the concept of a compatible paired kidney exchange. And the idea here is that you again have a blood group A donor that wants to donate to a blood group B recipient, therefore it's incompatible. But on the right, you have a donor-recipient pair where the donor may be compatible, but may have a very poor HLA match, maybe only one HLA match, and maybe a little bit older, so may provide somewhat less kidney function to the recipient husband. So by going into a paired exchange program, this wife and husband can actually get a better kidney for the recipient husband and also facilitate additional transplants for others. So in this example, the husband would potentially receive a 4 HLA match kidney from a donor who's 30 years old, who may have greater kidney function, and therefore a longer expected survival of that kidney. So next slide. This shows the growth of these compatible pairs over the last 7 or 8 years, from 3 that were done in the these are NKR transplants that were facilitated, to 68. So really a very substantial growth in the compatible pairs. And again, these recipients in compatible pairs have not only benefited by getting a presumably better kidney, but they've also facilitated more transplants for others. And it's always fascinating to me how many of the compatible pairs that we enter into the paired exchange program are highly motivated by compassion and altruism, and really part of what they want to do is really help the system. And it's been very successful. Next. And then the last concept I want to mention has to do with vouchers for kidneys, for what's sometimes been termed chronological incompatibility. And so some examples are listed here. If, for example, a teacher wanted to donate during the summer, when they would have the whole summer off and be able to recover from the transplant for the donation, but the recipient is not available or is out of town until September, so the teacher could donate in the summer, and actually in donating ahead of time would actually be able to potentially start a chain, thus help a number of additional donor-recipient pairs. And then when the recipient is ready to proceed with their transplant, they would receive one of these end-of-chain kidneys. And so again, not only would that chronological incompatibility be overcome, but the system would benefit as well. And that's actually a fairly common scenario. Another common scenario is when we have a grandparent who wants to donate to a grandchild, but for example, a grandchild that have kidney disease or already has a transplant. So the idea is the grandchild doesn't need another transplant yet, but may need another transplant in 20 or 25 years. So, and at that point, the grandparent may no longer be able to donate. So they're actually able to donate ahead of time, donate into the pool, and get a voucher for the grandchild when they need the kidney. And then the very most recent program is called the Family Voucher Program. Again, this is an NKR program. And the idea here is that a donor can donate and identify up to 5 healthy potential recipients. So typically family members, spouse. And it's possible that none of those 5 potential recipients would develop kidney disease in the future. But if one did, then any one of those 5 vouchers could be redeemed. And the idea is this has actually encouraged many people to become non-directed donors, especially if they were thinking they're, say, middle-aged and healthy and are thinking they might want to be a non-directed donor. But in the back of their mind, they're thinking that maybe their child or their spouse might need a kidney at some point in the future, maybe 10 years, 20 years, it's impossible to know. But by joining the Family Voucher Program, they can have that backup and know that if any one of their close family members ever needed a kidney, they're one of the 5 that they identified, that they'd be able to get one. And so UW Health has been instrumental in helping design actually both of these programs. And then we recently piloted the Family Voucher Program, and we've continued to expand our use of it. Next slide. So this shows the growth of these advanced donations there's 2 lines here. The blue line, the blue bars show the advanced donations themselves, and the red bars show the additional transplants that are facilitated. Because again, every time you put another kidney in this large pool, you can start a chain and help a number of additional people. So you can see, again, very dramatic growth in the use of this program. Next. And so finally, this shows the data from UW Health in terms of paired kidney transplants that we've performed. And you can see that between 2013 and 2019, the total number of paired kidney donation transplants performed went from 18 to 63. And the number of non-directed or family voucher donors went from 3 to 27. And the compatible pairs have increased a little bit, not quite as dramatically, because we've wanted to make sure that we don't disadvantage these donor recipient pairs in any way. But I suspect that we'll continue to expand that program as well. So just to show that paired kidney donation, I think, has been a very successful program. UW has been very enthusiastic about expanding it. And there's actually a number of very exciting programs that I expect will come into play in the coming years to continue to expand it and continue to benefit our patients. Thank you for your attention.
Wow, thank you, Didier. That's really inspiring information. Those donating chains are just beautiful examples of community and humanity. Well, now it's really a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Janina Smith. Dr. Smith is the medical director of the Transplant Infectious Disease Program at UW Health. She specializes in preventing, assessing, and treating infections in recipients of solid organ transplants and also in other immune-compromised hosts. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to speak with you tonight. I often get the question, why is it that there's specialized infectious disease doctors that deal with transplantation or other immunocompromised hosts? And the reason is that the medications that are used to help prevent rejection of an organ aren't specific for that organ, and they make the immune system less able to fight infection. And so at UW Health, we have a group of specialists in the types of infections that patients with compromised immune systems have. And so today, I'm delighted to talk to you about COVID-19 transplantation and UW Health, from the bench research to the bedside of patients and out into the community. Next slide. 1 year ago, on February 25th of 2020, Nancy Messonnier, the director of CDC's National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Disease, made the following quote: that we could expect disruption to everyday life, which may be severe. At that time, we couldn't have possibly comprehended what would happen in the upcoming year. Next slide. This is a screenshot of February of 2021, taken on the 19th, which show that the global spread of the COVID pandemic has now included over 110 million cases, over 250,000 deaths, US cases of 27 million. And unfortunately, this number has been updated, as we know, this week to a very sad total of over 500,000 of our countrymen passing from this horrible pandemic. And I think when we look at that, sometimes it's very hard not to be overwhelmed with the horrors that have been involved. Next slide. In these times, I like to refer to this quote from Fred Rogers, who says, "When I was a boy, I would see scary things in the news, and my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" Next slide. So today I want to take this opportunity to talk to you about some of our UW helpers and what helps. We have the great advantage, as you've already heard, of being one of the nation's largest transplant centers and really internationally recognized for our excellence in leading edge research. We also have the advantage of the huge research institution that has a lot of established collaboration between different departments on campus. We have an internationally recognized School of Public Health, and we really have unprecedented integration between our state public health infrastructure and the faculties and doctors on the front line. For example, our chief medical officer and state epidemiologist for communicable diseases has joint appointment in the Department of Medicine. In fact, his office is just down the hall from mine. Not only that, but we experience phenomenal community support. And all of those things together allow UW to be some of the premier helpers in the COVID pandemic. Next slide. I want to go through some narratives with you about the way that the helpers work together to help the public. And to start, just some basic information. SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, can only be studied in very specialized research labs for safety reasons. These are not available in most hospitals. And at the beginning of this pandemic, it was not known exactly how this virus spread from person to person or what needed to be done to keep our frontline healthcare workers safe. Next slide. An organ transplant recipient in our hospital did develop sickness with COVID-19 after being in the hospital for a long time. So it was probable that they got sick while they were in the hospital. And so this really led us to ask, how did this happen? But most importantly, also, how can we prevent it from happening again? Next slide. The UW solution, again, involves incorporation of all of those helpers together. Our UW Health frontline clinicians working together with our specialists in infection prevention and research, along with our campus virology research laboratory. And in this case, Dr. O'Connor, who works in the veterinary school, was critical in helping us find the solution. Next. Our clinical team identified the infection in the individual, identified the unique characteristics, and cared for the patient using the most cutting-edge, up-to-date research. Our infection preventionists evaluated the environment, did contact tracing, and undertook testing of all the contacts, including every healthcare worker, food service worker, maintenance worker, and all visitors. And then the research lab at UW that was able to do this very specialized genetic typing research genetically tested hundreds of samples to try to trace back where this infection could have come from. And they were able to calculate mathematically the lineage of the virus, which was able to pinpoint where the infection occurred and the relationship to all other viruses identified. Next slide. Based on this had tremendous impact. It had impact on the individual because we did directly identify the source of the infection. In our community, it stopped spread to anyone else because we knew where it had come from, but also changed our local policies to keep patients and the community safe. But I think perhaps most importantly is we were able to disseminate the knowledge of what we had learned to other hospitals throughout the world so that they could keep their healthcare workers and communities safer. Next slide. I want to introduce you to some of the UW Health helpers and the headlines that helped contribute to this small narrative that's advancing the science on COVID-19. This is Dr. O'Connor's lab. That's Dr. Friedman on the right, and a number of the students and postdoctorates that work with him. Again, they're through the veterinary school. Next slide. Our chief preventionist for infection who studies how things are spread is Dr. Nasia Safdar, and she's on the right. And these are just 3 of the publications that this team of grouping together to work together to solve problems in relationships to COVID that they've already produced and disseminated to the rest of the world. Next slide. The second narrative I'd like to speak to you about also relates to a fact that early in the pandemic, we began to recognize that COVID-19 was having a very disproportionate and devastating impact on communities of color. Next. This is an example taken from the CDC just February 12th, looking at the case rate, hospitalization rate, and death rate of a number of communities of color in comparison to white communities. And I think you can see very clearly the outsized number of cases, but hospitalization and death. Next slide. This holds true in Wisconsin as well, and this is data published. I think this is really helpful because just looking at it, you can see the disproportionate impact, both in terms of cases, but also deaths per 100,000 people in a number of communities of color across the state of Wisconsin. Next slide. So this led us to ask this narrative core question. The US was tasking states with developing plans to vaccinate their people. But how do we develop an equitable but efficient plan and establish priorities for vaccination and execute that plan using our available infrastructure? Next. The UW solution, again, required collaboration from a number of departments, both our UW Health public health researchers through our School of Public Health, communities who are disproportionately impacted, and state public health. Next. Together, the community team helped identify unique characteristics of the communities most impacted. They did tremendous advocacy as well as strategizing to overcome barriers to vaccination. Our public health researchers applied research to aid in the prioritization of vaccination to facilitate equitable distribution plans. And we executed a trial through employees of UW Health at the hospital. Finally, all of this was coordinated with the needs of the community for up-to-date research. Ethics specialists in public health from UW all worked with Wisconsin's Department of Public Health to constantly update a plan that would provide success and deal with our challenges with the constant goal of equitable distribution of the COVID vaccines. Next slide. This again has had a far-reaching impact on communities. The partnership was really the corner of the state vaccination plan. And within our community, our health equity research and the plan that we devised for equitable distribution to healthcare workers that impacted the world by showing the efficacy of our integrated public health and community-based teamwork to become the leader state, as I'll show you shortly. Next slide. I want to drill down a little bit about some of the research studies that helped advance this important priority. UW Health developed a COVID-19 vaccine prioritization tool with staff at UW Health and the Wisconsin Health Innovations Program. And this is actually a tool that incorporates the Social Vulnerability Index and age. So when we're thinking of healthcare workers, you might imagine that all the people who see patients at our hospital don't necessarily have the same vulnerability. And by using this tool, it equitably can distribute vaccines. And so this tool is now available to all healthcare centers in the world to use the model that was first trialed here. Next slide. I'd like to also introduce you to a researcher, Dr. Amy Kind, who first published a neighborhood map that helps guide medical decision-making by identifying neighborhoods that had social vulnerability to a variety of different diseases. And here we have the map of the United States, but also the map of Wisconsin. And she was really the first to publish on this type of tool to help identify communities that we could best serve. Next slide. So her research was then put in action. A brand new federal program which distributes vaccines directly to pharmacies, in addition to the state program I already spoke of, use this tool to distribute vaccines more equitably. For example, they had 17,000 doses of vaccines, and they distributed them to 178 different Walgreens stores in Wisconsin based on the underserved areas and the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which breaks down disparities by zip code. The state also has modified that to help factor in population rates and vaccine distribution to help equalize the allotment. And finally, earlier this month, the state also announced prioritizing health centers that administer federal health programs because it's shown that those serve a larger proportion of our minority residents. Next slide. We've also used these lessons to help our transplant community by developing specialized outreach for communities where English is not the primary language and assuring our patients with greatest vulnerability have access to vaccination. We plan on using this cutting-edge research and advocacy to continue to lead the way. Next slide. I want to introduce you to one of our UW helpers, and this is Madisonian, Wisconsin's own Dr. Fauci. This is Dr. Ryan Westergaard, who is the Chief Medical Officer and State Epidemiologist. And if you watch the news, you've probably seen him on advocating for patients but he is also UW Health faculty, an important helper to know. Next slide. These efforts together have led to some very good early successes, but also continued dynamic efforts to improve. And Wisconsin recently moved to the top of the nation in daily COVID-19 vaccinations and has plans for ramping up free clinics. So I think this shows our tremendous impact because our research really leads the way for this important, very important and critical step of vaccinating the public. Next slide. Finally, I'd just like to leave you with this thought, because throughout the COVID pandemic, it was a totally new virus that we knew nothing about. And our UW Health physicians, scientists, researchers, and the coordination between all of them really embodied, I think, this quote from Maya Angelou, which says, "Do the best you can until you know better. But then when you know better, you do better." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeanina. We're now going to move forward from one Dr. Smith to another outstanding Dr. Smith, Dr. Jason Smith, who serves as the Surgical Director of Heart Transplantation and Mechanical Support. Dr. Jason Smith's research focuses on heart transplant organ preservation, leading the ongoing search for novel approaches that can expand the supply of donor organs, and also working on artificial heart pumps. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Smith.
Thank you very much, Dean Golden, for having me tonight, and for the audience for sharing your evening with us. As Dean Golden suggested, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about expanding heart transplantation and what we've done over the last couple of years to increase access to heart transplantation for Wisconsin and our neighboring states that come to us for help. Next slide, please. From the very beginning of time, from mythologies of Pied Chow and Cosmos and Damien to the experiments of Le Gaulois to Correll and Jabolet's surgical techniques, and then ultimately the fathers of transplantation in the modern era, Dr. Shumway and Dr. Bernard, transplantation has captured the imagination, and heart transplantation in particular represents the culmination of 2,000 years of imagining and experimenting and effort in medicine to achieve really this pinnacle therapy. And heart transplantation gives patients the opportunity to experience the transformative care that we've developed in the modern era. And this transformation allows patients to move from the mortal condition of advanced heart failure to lead a robust and active life. And this is one of the most rewarding experiences, I think, in medicine, and certainly in my career. Next slide. But this therapy has a problem, and that problem is something we refer to as the heart gap. There is a gap between the number of hearts available. This slide on the left shows you the early ramping up of heart transplantation around the world, and then a 30-year plateau in the number of transplants performed both in Europe and in the United States, with just a slight tick up here at the end, which I will explain later on. But on the right, you see the constant increase in the number of patients listed for heart transplantation. And those represent just a small portion of the growth in the population. And as the population grows, the people who need transplantation continues to increase. But the number of transplants has remained stagnant for many, many decades. So, what can we do about this? And one aspect of trying to match the number of organs available with the number of recipients is to try to utilize those organs that are gifted in the most efficient way possible. And that's one of the things that we've tried to do here. 3 programs that we've instituted over the last year have really been instrumental in some changes that we've made. Next slide, please. The first is using what we call expanded criteria donors. We made a concerted effort about 2 years ago to expand our use of donors that met some expanded criteria. And these would be things like organs that were exceptionally far away, so a long travel time to recover the organs, and using technology and surgical techniques and preservation techniques to safely bring back organs from a wider radius. Other things would be donors of a little bit older age and using those same technologies to preserve organs that work well, but maybe are a little bit older and had been shied away from. Also, perhaps donors with some more complex infectious risks that need to be managed. All of this has led the University of Wisconsin to really the forefront in every category of organ utilization. Next slide. The second big effort that we made was opening what we call a hepatitis C donor program. And you may have seen some of the commercials on TV for the new class of direct-acting antiviral medications that treat hepatitis C. And these medications, have been a remarkable addition to the armamentarium in medicine in general in actually curing hepatitis C and doing it in an extremely effective way. That led us to think about trying to utilize hep C positive organs, which in previous years would have been thrown away, and treating recipients after the transplant to cure them of the hepatitis C that would be brought with the organ. And nationwide, we found that to be a very effective way to do transplant and way to augment the number of organs available. We started our program here almost 2 years ago and have significantly expanded the number of hearts available. A number of patients have benefited from this program, been able to receive excellent organs in a much shorter time frame, and gone on to regain their life and their health. We've had, in both our program and across the country, no reported failures of therapy for the hepatitis C treatment. So this has been really remarkable and effective program. Next slide. But probably the most game-changing piece of the donor expansion that we've worked on over the past couple of years has been the addition of what we call donation after cardiac death donors to the heart transplant armamentarium. In the very beginning of heart transplantation back in 1967, donors would have to die of a cardiac death, meaning the support would be withdrawn, the heart would be allowed to stop, and then the donor would be rushed off to the operating room, the organs recovered, and the heart packed in ice and rushed off to the recipient. That approach to transplantation led to some pretty dismal outcomes. The initial period you can see here on the right graph shows a great jump in the number of transplants because everyone got super excited about heart transplantation after the Christian Bernard's first transplant in South Africa. And over 100 centers started doing transplants. But very quickly thereafter, the number of transplants dropped way back down to less than 20 a year. And that's because of the variable and unpredictable outcomes with this technique of organ procurement. Shortly thereafter, in the early 1970s, we developed the concept of brain death, and transplantation slowly started to increase again with this new technique using brain dead donors. And that carried on until the 1980s when cyclosporin was introduced, effective immunosuppression was introduced, and the number of transplants jumped up to the current level of about 3,000 a year, heart transplants, and then leveled off in the 1990s, ne'er to grow again until today. And this stagnant problem has led us to reinvestigate what we can do with those donation after cardiac death donors that could augment the pool of hearts available for transplant and help our recipients. Next slide, please. You can see that the donation after cardiac death volumes in the United States, and this would be for donors, not specifically heart donors, has been increasing for the last 20 years and now makes up a very large number of potential heart donors, none of which have been able to give their hearts to date. But a new technology has come along that allows us to revisit those DCD hearts. And that is what we call an ex vivo, or out of the body, machine perfusion strategy to protect organs. In sort of a lay term, this would be taking the heart in a box, as some people call it. But the heart is removed from the donor, placed on a machine that pumps blood into the coronary arteries and allows the heart to beat and stay warm. And that gives us an opportunity to reassess the hearts, to investigate the function of the heart, and be certain that the heart is going to be of a high quality before transplanting the heart. And then we can move forward once we achieve those goals with high confidence that these organs are going to work well and support our patients moving forward. Next slide, please. Can you advance the slide, please? Okay, while we're trying to get the next slide moved forward, what you're going to see on the next slide here is the machine pumping the heart outside the body. The heart is beating all on its own. There's nothing artificial about the heart beating. The heart will beat all by itself as soon as the coronaries have blood flowing through them. The heart is warm. We can do an echocardiogram. We can draw labs from the heart to make sure it's metabolically performing in an appropriate fashion, and then move on to transplanting the heart once the recipient is prepared. So this technology has really expanded our ability to take these challenging organs, or what used to be challenging organs, and make them a really viable source of organs going forward. And the studies so far have been completed in Europe and in Australia, have shown that these hearts perform as good, or in some studies even better than, our standard donors that we've been using for the last 50 years. Our trial in the United States is just completed, and we're accruing that data, and hopefully we'll have it out shortly, but we're excited for those results. Next slide, please. So this shows you what the impact of all of these programs has been at the University of Wisconsin. And what you see here is the median waiting time at the University of Wisconsin for a heart transplant from each of these different blood types. And that's measured in days. So, and the University of Wisconsin is here in black. So 5 days for a blood type A, and so forth and so on. What you see in the red to the right is the average waiting time for the same blood type at the national level, so the national average. And it's pretty remarkable. Those numbers are correct. They're not missing zeros off the end. These strategies to bring more hearts into the system has had a really paradigm shifting impact on our ability to get patients to transplant quickly and safely. Next slide, please. And you can see here the volumes, about the middle of the slide is when we put these programs into effect. And the volume in the blue line is the number of transplants has gone up dramatically. And in the gray line is the percent mortality or deaths related to transplant has gone down significantly. And so we've been able to improve the quality and the quantity of transplants performed at our center. Next slide, please. So that is really what I wanted to talk about tonight, but there's a lot going on at the University of Wisconsin. We have new projects to expand donors even further using a new method of DCD heart procurement called normothermic regional perfusion. We've got new projects to improve the safety of transplantation using donor whole blood resuscitation. And hopefully I can be invited back at some point to talk about some of these new exciting programs that we'll have up and running shortly. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Jason. That's what would have been science fiction when I was a kid is now cutting edge reality and will become old hat with the progress that's being made here. We have a number of questions coming in. I'm going to try to pick from them a question for each of our speakers. Let's start with one for Didier. Can you tell us more about how somebody gets into the process of being an altruistic donor? How does that happen?
Sure. Well, I want to start by saying that, living donors are really an incredible group of people. It's one of the real pleasures of my job is working with living donors who, give altruistically of themselves, literally. And then non-directed or altruistic donors are even a step beyond that, in that they're giving, even more for no benefit to themselves and giving, for the good of the community. And it's obviously a decision that has to be made very carefully. So the nuts and bolts of it is basically anybody who's interested would contact the UW Transplant Center, anybody in the area. In general, somebody would contact their local transplant center. And it's important, to get, there is a lot of information out there about the process and the internet in general. And I would mention that UW has recently revised all our living donor information materials on our website. And in particular, there's information on non-directed donation. So there's a lot of information that can be obtained. And then the contact with the UW Transplant Center can either be online or directly through by phone with one of the coordinators. And after that, the potential donors can be taken through the process. And the other thing I would mention is that for altruistic donors, as well as any potential live donor, there's really no commitment at any point until they're scheduled for the operating room. They can really back out at any point. They can really start off just by getting information. It's not an obligation to continue. They can get preliminary testing. Even after that, there's no obligation to continue. So there's a lot of information, and there's a lot of sort of steps and educating before that can proceed.
Great, thank you. Here's one for you, Janina. You were highlighting very nicely the challenges of health disparities. When it comes to transplantation, do we observe disparities in terms of access to recipient of transplants?
Absolutely. There's tremendous disparities in terms of who gets referred to transplant by their primary care physician. There's data that persons of color have waited longer on dialysis. And UW Health, again, is on the cutting edge of really assuring that we work to minimize those disparities. So Dr. Mandelbrot, you may be able to speak of some of the mechanisms, but some are outreach that has been developing clinics all around the state, providing materials and education to primary providers, as well as outreach to patients and communities as well. It's an important issue. It's one that we can always do better. but we're working hard to recognize the importance of those. DA?
I think that was a good answer.
Very good. Here's one for you, Jason. You did a very nice job of talking about ways in which we can improve the utilization from donors. On the other end, when we look at recipients, what makes for a good recipient? What would make somebody a top of the list kind of person to benefit the most from it?
Well, so first of all, you don't want to be at the top of the heart. So what makes you a good candidate for the top of the heart transplant list is not what makes you a great candidate for transplant. So let me start there. The very sickest patients get the highest points for transplant in heart transplantation. So you, as most people say, you want to be the uninteresting patient, not the interesting patient. But more generally, I think it's a really good question. What makes you a good transplant candidate at the most fundamental level is having what we call end-stage heart disease, having a disease that we can treat with heart transplantation. Not everything that's wrong with the heart is necessarily solved by heart transplantation, although many things. So having a disease that really doesn't have another straightforward medical fix and is severe enough to warrant the therapy and is treatable by transplant. And in very simple terms, that's what we're looking for.
Yeah.
And then what makes you really the other big piece of that is that we can do this operation for you and help you. So not having other diseases that would, one, limit your life expectancy regardless of the transplant, or having other diseases that would impact on your function in a way that would make it not helpful to have a transplant. So those are kind of the things we're balancing when we are looking for a good transplant candidate. And we'd like to get you in early before you get to the top of the list.
Right, right. Thanks. So let's try a question in the remaining time for each of you to answer, and we can sort of go in the order of the presentations. For each of you, as you wake up in the morning and think not about that day, but think about the next 10 years, what makes you most excited, most optimistic about the 10-year future of the whole field of transplantation? Why don't we start with you, Didier?
Well, we continue to make all sorts of incremental developments. We continue to be able to save more lives. There's a lot of sort of long-term goals, maybe holy grails in the transplant world, which might include, developing tolerance. In other words, being able to immunosuppress patients without all the side effects of immunosuppression, and potentially putting people like Janina out of a job. And there's an organ shortage. Dr. Jason Smith talked about that quite a bit. There's a lot of future developments in terms of so-called xenotransplantation, or getting essentially limitless supply of organs from animals, potentially getting a limitless supply of organs from stem cells, developing organs. So there's a lot of exciting things sort of in the long term. Hopefully they won't always be just around the corner, as some people have said, because they're important goals, but they're very hard to attain. But I think we are making some very exciting progress. And those are some of the kind of big picture things we look forward to.
Excellent. How about you, Janina?
Awesome. Well, I would love to be put out of business because of better immune suppression for patients. But I will say, with the advances in immune suppression, perhaps even more heartening, we've been able to utilize these life-saving techniques for sicker and sicker patients. So when Dr. Jason Smith was speaking earlier about what makes someone a candidate for transplantation, for example, severe kidney disease used to sort of rule someone out for a heart transplant, but UW Health is really on the cutting edge of multi-organ transplantation, including doing kidney transplant with heart transplant, for example. But when I'm looking forward at the next 10 years, though I would love to be put out of business because of immune tolerance, I think what I see is the increasing development of drugs to treat infections that used to be either untreatable or incredibly difficult to treat. And I will tell a little story of how UW Health has participated. There are some fungal infections that can happen in the setting of the immune suppression of transplantation that can be extremely severe, to the point that they were almost not survivable in the past. My colleague, Dr. Andes, is on the cutting edge of developing some of these antifungal treatments. And I remember seeing a heart transplant patient who developed an extremely severe fungal infection that went throughout her body. All of her body parts were involved. In fact, it was found on a biopsy from her transplanted heart. And I was devastatingly concerned about her. But we were in the drug treatment trial for a brand new drug. The old drug is called amphotericin. We call it amphoterrible because it's so hard to take, makes patients so sick. So we tried this new drug, and like a miracle, she left the hospital. She was well. This was a postpartum heart, you get a cardiomyopathy from postpartum. So she had a little baby at home. And it was one of the happiest moments in my life to see that transformation from the sickest you can be to perfectly well. And so I think we'll continue to be on the cutting edge of drug development to offer new and better treatments that are better to tolerate. And this partnership with the Transplant Program really allows us to be on the cutting edge of that.
Wow, this is a tough act to follow, Jason, batting cleanup in this question, but what gets you most excited about the future?
Obviously, a lot of the same things. One thing that I think hasn't been mentioned that really gets me excited about the future is sort of the professionalization of transplantation. I think for a long time, transplantation medicine was sort of the cowboy and anecdotal field that really didn't have the same level of research effort and scientific, I wouldn't say scientific investigations. There's a lot of exceptional work has been done, but not a lot of work on patient safety and best practices and developing really highly effective therapies or regimens of therapy. And I think that's happening in transplant now to a degree it hasn't in the past. And I think that bodes well for the future of transplantation in terms of the quality that we can deliver across the field. I think from a personal standpoint, I'm excited about the expansion of multi-visceral or multi-organ transplants and how that's going to impact patients that have not been able to access this therapy in the past, at least not as easily. And I think expansion in the care around transplant. So trying to find ways to bring patients to the University of Wisconsin to get the therapy, working on simple things like housing and feeding and transportation for patients and families, and building an infrastructure that can really help patients get through the whole process, because the surgery itself is only a small piece of getting a patient through transplant. It takes it takes a big village, a lot of people, a lot of effort, and a lot of time. So I think that's what gets me excited.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank all of you. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and we're about out of time for this session. In addition to thanking you, our presenters, I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us this evening and for your great questions. I hope you've enjoyed this first in the reboot of Wisconsin Medicine, and that you'll continue to tune in for our next program, which is coming up 2 weeks from today, Wednesday, March 10th, which will focus on immunotherapy, another fascinating, rapidly developing field. You can sign up to receive reminder emails, and you can also watch past sessions at wiscmedicine.org. So again, thank you so much for sharing your evening with us. Be safe, take care of yourselves, and on Wisconsin. Good night.